Hi, everybody. Welcome to the learning session on productive conversations. I'm Dan Croft, Senior Manager of Engineering for Release and Package. Myself and several other people at GitLab have been attending 7CTOs as a pilot program. These discussion points and learnings that we have here came directly from the 7CTOs training. Mac, myself, and Christopher all found these really valuable. So, which is why we wanted to share them with a broader set of people at GitLab, because we thought lots of people could get value out of it. Having said that, if people have any questions that come up during this, please feel free to add them to the agenda. There's a document there. Thank you, Chase, for adding one already. With that, I'm hoping to get through both the ladder and the productive conversations in, say, about 15 minutes each. And then sort of more discussion questions, and I'm grateful for Mac and Christopher both joining to help me out with questions. So yeah, awesome. With that, I'll get started. Everyone can link to the Ladder of Inference document that's linked within the agenda. And if anyone can't see it, please let me know. I thought I'd done the permissions correct with it, maybe not. Going through the Ladder of Inference, there's a fancy diagram there, which would people prefer I share my screen, or are people happy to look at it directly themselves?
I'm good just looking at it side by side.
Yeah, that's usually what I like to do, but I didn't want to make that choice for everyone if they'd like to have it on screen. Yeah, so the steps through here, you can see that this sort of ladder out of the pool of available data, you know, the straight path here is, you know, we have an available pool of data as we all kind of quite mechanical terms that we have for it, but we know a certain set of things. We'll do some conscious and subconscious selection of things out of that pool of data, and then we'll have assumptions around that as well. Conclusions come out of the assumptions, and then actions from conclusions. What I found really interesting about this particular diagram, at least, was the sort of the steps back and coming to conclusions or taking actions actually contribute back to our pool of available data and the data selection. So they'll necessarily, well, maybe not necessarily, but often change our perception of what we're looking at and how we interpret events around us. So we impact our own selection. And I think it's worth recognizing those two loops, and there's a little sidebar on the side, which is, you know, your beliefs and conclusions become so closely held that you only seek out data that supports them. You could probably, I think that's referred to as confirmation bias, and in some capacity at least. And then your actions create responses, circumstances in the world, new observable data that further proves your assumptions and conclusions. Again, I think for me, this has really been my experience of interacting with other people. Our actions and our interactions will dictate how we perceive other people and the situations we're in. For the sake of the video and for other people following along at home, I'm going to read through the bit below here. We live in a world of self-generating beliefs, which remain largely untested. We adopt those beliefs because they are based on conclusions, which are inferred from what we observe, plus our past experience. And our ability to achieve the results we truly desire is eroded by our feelings that, 1, our beliefs are the truth, 2, truth is obvious, 3, our beliefs are based on real data, and 4, the data we select are the real data. And for reference, and just to be upfront, this comes from the 5th Discipline Field Book, copyright 1994. Mac, Christopher, do you feel like you want to share anything on this portion?
Sure, I can go first. I think the key takeaway when I was in the session in 7CTOs is that this framework is a bit complex to use right off the bat. The important thing is to remind yourself that when you're about to reach an assumption, there may be still additional pools of data that you haven't looked at, because there's still always a bias of your thinking is correct, and that the assumption that you make from what you observe is the truth, and it may not be. I think the two loops here can be hard to use as muscle memory at first, but a good guidance is always try to climb down the ladder before you jump to conclusion or an action. I think that the worst case is you're stuck at just assumptions and you ignore the data that's around you, or you might have to seek them out. That was the key takeaway from the session that I had, at least. Open to maybe Christopher, you can chime in.
Yeah, I think what was interesting about this one in particular is if you were very systematic on your thinking about how to reach both conclusions and actions, this is exactly what you follow. What I think this is really fundamentally challenging is sometimes when you either have biases or other things, and that's kind of what eventually really resonated with me, was the fact of, okay, like a term I saw recently was recency bias, which is a good time to be talking about because we're talking about 360 reviews. We'll have a tendency to talk about something that's happened immediately related to somebody, as opposed to really trying to think about it holistically over the period of time where they maybe had different experiences. So it's important to kind of recognize that, and it's also important to challenge yourself. I think is the key. The aha moment that I had was like, okay, you're going to use the same methodology potentially to do the same things, but you better challenge yourself back all the way back to even the pool of data that you're pulling from around that.
Yeah, and I think what I love about this is I think the example that comes up for me, which I find really interesting in the way that we think, is people who observe some event, a witness to a crime or whatever it might be. There's we always have this kind of funny idea that there's three versions of the truth type thing, because our own perception isn't guaranteed. What we believe 100% isn't always actually what happened or what was fact. And so I find that part of this super interesting, just from a introspective standpoint of well, what are my assumptions? And this is super helpful, like Mick said, walking down the ladder and really fundamentally questioning whether you really have all the data. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions about that? I was going to move on to the next page there, which was the questions to ask, if people didn't have anything specific there.
Yeah, I put a comment down in the document, but I think maybe your description of the crime is maybe part of the point of this, which is that this pool of data is not necessarily well defined, right? And I think that's one of the challenges, is sometimes we may all look at the same Periscope Periscope screen and say, hey, we're all looking at the same data. How are we getting to different conclusions? When in fact, we all have other pools of data that may not be explicit that we're pulling from. And I think that maybe that's part of the point of this, is that we have to realize that there are other pools of data. They may be hidden pools or things that are coming from our own experiences. But just because we think we're looking at the same pool of data doesn't necessarily mean that's the case.
Yeah, agreed. And I think I think this is an exercise for people, maybe not in the context of this meeting, but if you go through the Larry example, which is the subsequent page that's on the document that we have, it kind of teases some of that stuff out, and it's really a really good case study or scenario to walk through. Thanks for that, Seth.
It may also be good to recognize Periscope as a selection of data as well. There's other data beyond, so that's aggregates and whatnot, and simplification of data as well. So different layers, I'm sure.
Dana, thanks for that. That resonates with me a lot, because you see the recursive loop with actions and pool of data. So the dashboards we create today affects the pool of data tomorrow. So if there are things that we haven't created, that means that the pool is bigger, and sometimes it's not there because we never thought of creating those types of data. So our actions do reflect the available of data in the future.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm also trying to take notes. If anyone wants to contribute, that would be really helpful. Thanks.
Chase had a comment in the notes. Looks like, did that get discussed?
Yeah, I was gonna, for more general questions, I was thinking we would have them after we sort of walk through this stuff. I was more thinking these specific questions are do I understand what we're talking about right in context? Do we need to clarify a little more to help people be on the same page? So these broader questions maybe after, well, after definitely, because that was the intent. Cool. So moving on to the second page here, what we have is a list of those sort of steps on the ladder and some questions to ask. To me, this sort of resonates or harkens back to the powerful questions training that we had quite some time ago on 7 CTOs. Powerful questions is something that I use quite a lot and I find it extremely valuable. And they're those sort of open-ended questions that we ask that sort of get people's, maybe get people thinking about something from a different perspective or whatever it is. Chase can speak to me, trying to do that actively when we have conversations, and I'm sure other people can who I've spoken with. But these list of questions maybe help us define and determine where we are at each step and how we can evaluate our sort of decision-making processes around each of those steps. So I tend to think of these in the other way around, which is funny because they're listed action, conclusion, assumption, data selection, data pool. I think of them in the inverse, but I'll read in top to bottom order because that's what it is. But action is, examples of powerful questions here are, what's your greatest concern around the action? What is at stake by taking this action? So I don't want to read through all of these because I feel like that's not a good use of our sync time because we could read through them ourselves. But what might be worth doing here is sort of walking through some of these questions here and either identifying something that really resonates with you as you think about the way you come to conclusions and take actions and the experience you've had working with other people. And we'll get to sort of some more active uses of this when we talk about the productive conversation section of this training. But some of these are really cool. And they're intended to be something you could actively ask someone. How did you come to this conclusion? Or what other data do you need? So yeah, Mac and Christopher, if you have any thoughts around these questions, I find them really helpful.
I think my thought is I do find them helpful. Like when I look at this, I usually focus in on one question for a given area, potentially, not all of them. So that's one thing I caution everybody is don't, feel like you have to be exhaustive here. There's some good examples of that, like under conclusions, what opportunities does your conclusion create? I think that's a great one in the example of, like if you reach a conclusion, but it didn't really create an opportunity for you, then you may have figured something out, but you didn't necessarily, there's nothing you can do with it, right? So that's kind of an example of why I think those are important questions to ask.
Yeah, agreed. Mac, I'm not sure if you feel like you want anything to add here.
This is where I sometimes find it good to just print it out because it's really hard to refer to it every time you go into a conversation. So yeah, it's hard to wield as muscle memory, as I said before. It's good to like look at it every once in a while with your one-on-ones with your direct reports, if you're like planning an OKR or doing a retrospective on an incident or whatnot. I think that's for me. For me personally, the data pool, when I ask my team, is okay, is it seem doing well or not? What is the data that we have? What is the data that we haven't looked at? I think those are the common questions I use. I haven't been able to had the opportunity to use the assumptions and conclusions that mostly still around the data selection realm. Hopefully that's useful.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Cool. And I think we're sort of right at that 15-minute mark now. Does anyone have any sort of clarifying questions around some of these sort of powerful questions for each of the rungs in the ladder, or are people happy to move on? Daniel, if your mic came on. Oh, you're on mute. I apologize.
Cool.
All righty. And the last thing here is
Dennis talking,
Dennis
but I
talking and
his
you
mic's
can't hear him.
Oh, thank you.
No,
We can't hear
still
you.
not
Dennis.
hearing you.
We believe in you, Dennis.
My microphone just stopped working.
You are good now.
We
can hear you. Yep, you're good.
Okay. Sorry about that. So I understand the ladder of inference is something of a tool for us to have a productive conversation. Perhaps I'm missing some context, but based on this tool, it's assuming or I guess assuming we take action based on our conclusions, is that kind of the goal of what is defined as a product conversation? And what I mean by, or I guess another way of asking that is, do we always expect to take action out of a productive conclusion, or could perhaps just understanding as a result of that conclusion be an outcome of that productive conversation? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think this is more, I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer your question very well, Dennis. I'm not sure I fully understand it. I think the way I look at the ladder of inference here is like a way to understand how do we come to each of these steps, and a way to model it, and then to actively and put a structure around it, which may not be exactly what people, how you might model it yourself, but it's a way to sort of go, okay, well then how am I coming to a conclusion? I don't think it necessitates you go from that rung on the ladder to the next one, right? I think it's more like, okay, I think I need to make a decision. Well, what data have I got? What assumptions am I making? I'm not at action point right now. I'm not at conclusion point right now, but you can evaluate each, like iterate through each of these steps and sort of evaluate where you are and whether you maybe could consider more things. Does that feel like it answers your question somewhat?
Yeah, I think part of it was perhaps coming from Christopher's note about the question of what opportunities does your conclusion create. I do believe it's a good question. I guess, I mean, I'm learning about it now, but I just wasn't sure if like, is there always going to be an opportunity, or is like, if you're seeking understanding, will there always be an action item to take out of it? Usually you would want to, but I just was kind of trying to understand if every rung was kind of required to walk through, so to say.
I don't think every rung's required to walk through personally. And I don't think necessarily just because you draw conclusions, you take action. There is conscious decision to leave, like as an example, you could argue that the conclusion may be different, but like, if a conclusion is we could improve things, but the costs associated with it make it really close that it's maybe net neutral. So therefore, to be less disruptive, we're not going to take any further action. That's a conclusion, right? From that perspective, but you're not actually going to take action on it. So, I think not reaching a conclusion may be an interesting one. That may be a case where it just became less relevant, whatever it was you were working on. But that's more of like an in-process kind of statement.
Got it.
I think that kind of leads into my comment there about Boyd's OODA loop of like how, like here's this other cycle that has the same sorts of things, but like using the ladder to inform this, like drill down and inform your what happens at each point of that bigger loop, perhaps. Yeah. So just something there.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chase. I know a lot of people were clicking in and checking that out, so thank you for sharing it. I certainly had a look at it as well. Yeah, I think I kind of, from my perspective, I sort of look at it like, hey, maybe this process of coming to conclusions, assumptions, and that is a little bit opaque to even ourselves. So providing some type of model that resonates a little bit, might be a different model, might be the same one, just to provide people tools to be able to evaluate their own decision-making processes and how they're relating with the world around them in the context of work, So I appreciate you sharing this. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks.
I want to add that sometimes it might not lead to an action, but more of a confirmation that you are on the right path. I think the key here is that make sure you are considering all data that is available or may not be available to reduce the bias on only your purview. I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, thanks for that, Meg. Cool. Does anyone else have any thoughts, questions, or comments on the ladder of inference? It may, when we start talking about the productive conversations, this is part of that. So that might help make more sense of it for you, for everyone. Cool, and we can always put questions in the document. So like happy to, we can circle back at the end if people would like to. So I'm gonna move on to the productive conversations. Sorry, the document, my sort of slight OCD kicks in because I say productive conversations, the document's called 7 Steps of Productive Conversations, and then the title is Steps for a Productive Conversation. I'm always like slightly jarring at reading all those different explanations of things. So that's why I'm kind of hesitating here. So I apologize for that. So there are 7 steps, so that works well. First step is prepare. And as I mentioned just before, we talked about how the ladder of inference is actually part of a productive conversations model that we sort of covered at 7 CTOs, as I mentioned earlier. A and B within prepare, where are you on the ladder of inference? What data are you missing? And again, this is in the context of having a conversation with another person. What information does the other person have or not have? What assumptions are you making? And it even calls out to list them. And what conclusions are you drawing? Second part of that is, what is your contribution to the situation? It's not fault, avoidance, fear of the outcome, speaking about the past is a way that was indirect, unclear. I'm sort of skimming through this. I feel like it's worthwhile covering this for people who review the video later, as I mentioned earlier. So I feel like it's worth skimming through this stuff, but I also don't want to take too much time for people. Be efficient here. Second step, which I find something that I'm very fond of myself, is to exercise your empathy muscle before and during the conversation. Put yourself in the other person's shoes, attempt to see their point of view. What feelings could be driving their behavior? What feelings are triggered in me? I find this is extremely useful. It's very easy to be on the defensive. For me, maybe, I don't want to speak for others, but it's very easy to feel defensive about a situation where something you're doing or a view you have is challenged. So this is super valuable to me. 3 is stay with the facts. Only describe observable, provable behaviors, specific examples. Avoid attributing cause effect, lecturing, saying words like should and why. Step 4 is ask powerful questions to move from certainty to curiosity. These are some examples. What is your take on the situation? What's on your mind? What else? Say more about that. Use as a stall tactic. This is pretty funny to me. Use as a stall tactic if you're having a reaction or don't know what to ask initially. If it's the only thing you ask, conversation turns into an explainer and primarily serves you. What's the biggest challenge for you? What makes you think that? What data facts are you relying on, especially after they've talked through the tell me more? What assumptions are you making about you, me, others based on the facts? This is something that I certainly have to practice and consciously practice. Listen for understanding and not to affirm your position, assumptions, point of view. Do not react to answers. Point 6 is collaborate for resolution. What do you see as the best path forward? What will you do to turn this around? What is your next best step? What support do you need from me? How will you keep me in the loop? And then 7 has or in front of it. Deliver bad news quickly and compassionately. This is from Difficult Conversations. The and stance is your friend. I am firing you and I know you've made an effort to improve and it's not enough to meet expectations. This example feels like one of the worst ones to go to in terms of delivering bad news, but it actually refers to one of the scenarios below here. The scenarios in 7 CTOs in forums, we actually broke out into smaller groups to discuss the scenarios and how we would use these 7 steps in those scenarios. And it was a little bit odd, if I remember correctly, for our group, because we, it was like, okay, am I playing this role? How exactly am I supposed to be? And it was kind of an interesting role playing. We do use role playing a little bit in the forums in my experience, and it has been quite useful. But if you want to quickly evaluate in these sort of bigger groups, I think it's a little harder to do that. But in these bigger groups, maybe evaluate those questions in the context of the 7 steps. Cool. Mac or Christopher, do you want to sort of speak to the productive conversations steps?
One other thing that we covered in our training session on this was getting feedback from others on not feedback of what you personally, but challenging yourself to say, which one of these are you weakest on, or you feel like you're weakest on? So like as an example for me, I felt like my exercise of my empathy muscle is actually probably the one that not necessarily up to the conversation, but in a conversation, sometimes I don't necessarily focus on that as much. The other thing that I kind of wanted to note is so often we get immediately to, here's how I want things to change, or here's what I'm expecting, setting expectations, as opposed to sometimes engaging in conversations just to gather more data. You know, and this is an example, understanding what's going on in a person's personal life or things of that nature that's sometimes important from that perspective. So just those two were kind of things that came to mind from ours.
That's great. I'm happy to add more and be transparent. I'm not very good with point 3, and that's an exercise I've done before. Sometimes I tend to be prescriptive rather than suggest, and then every time I talk to a direct report, I would always say it's a suggestion, not a prescription. So don't take it and run with it. I want to hear what you're trying to do, what your thoughts are. The other thing I want to add is the powerful questions. I think we do have them listed somewhere. Daniel Croft, I think you shared it with us a long time ago. I think the powerful questions, I think those are also another cheat sheet that I found really useful that I'm opening on the side. Sometimes use it in our conversations. I think that's a template that you can just take right off the bat, and you can focus on other areas.
Yeah, no, and I think these are resources that I think are really helpful for me, and I, you know, just for everyone else's context, Matt, Christopher, and I had a meeting about sort of setting some way up to start sharing this information more broadly among the team, which is why we chose to do this, or decided this would be a good thing. Maybe I should say Christopher decided this would be a good thing. But you know, it's definitely something that I think is great. I found it super valuable. But those resources, so these PDFs, these are disseminated in 7 CTOs. They've said it's okay for us to share them. And so I feel like we should come up with some way to actually share these in general. But I would say, just to sort of follow the model that Christopher and Mac have sort of started, I generally I like to think I'm good with the empathy thing, but I guess I wonder about my pool of assumptions and how that impacts my perception and all those sorts of things. I'm sort of actively working on these things, so I think sometimes I do speak more prescriptively, like Mac mentioned, but I'm often really aware of it right away, and I start apologizing. And so I'm like, hey, sorry, don't take this as a directive. It's not. I like, this is just the way I'm phrasing it. I need to be better at that. But I think the big things I struggle with is the bad news side of things. That's always the hardest for me. It's really, really difficult. You know, the example they use, just to call that out particularly, I find that, you know, letting someone go is one of the worst things, even if it's justified totally the way it should be done or whatever. It's one of the worst things that they've had to do. I just don't ever like doing that. But it's extremely difficult on everyone, and I'm certainly not the one that's the worst off out of that scenario either. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Anyone have any clarifying questions or other conversation points they wanted to raise out of that?
Saw Daniel ask about the book. I was going to make sure you got his question answered.
Yeah, I slid that down the list because I wanted to make sure it was coming up next.
So one question I had on this is, this all works well, I think, when you have kind of an organic meeting. And I'm wondering how this plays in if you have a meeting with an agenda, right? And it's like, hey, we're going to talk about topic 1, 2, and 3, and how you can start working through some of these steps in the context of having an agenda.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends on I would say it kind of depends on uh, the nature of the agenda items, right? Like sometimes we can take a look at this. I would say that when I look at an agenda item, like I came into this meeting before it started and checked it to see if we had any questions, and then I went, and the one that was in there was Chase's comment about the OODA loop, right? So I went to look at that and read it and sort of go, okay, what are we talking about here? And it's sort of part of the prep thing. So how we mesh this into a GitLab style agenda built meeting is maybe, do you feel that's a fair representation of your question, Seth?
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Because,
Yeah.
for example, like one of the things that we kind of do at GitLab is it's like come to the table, have something that you're presenting, and then people can respond to it. And so the problem with that is it comes often. You can come to a meeting with a prescription, and that's one of the things that we're saying. Hey, don't do that. You know, look at your assumptions, look at the pool of data first, and then start kind of building from there. And so coming to the table with an agenda can sometimes put off other people that want to start at the bottom and say, hey, I'm looking at this data differently. I was looking at a different source, and build from there.
Yeah, and I think that is a bit of a challenge, and it kind of depends on, like, I would kind of say that this sort of meets somewhere with our DRI model as well, where I think the way we try to organize decision making at GitLab might mean that the person who's the DRI is perhaps the one that sort of evaluates it at this level. And that if I'm participating in that meeting and I see a agenda item that I'm interested in, I might say, oh, okay, hey, this looks good. And but I'm not sure where the data is coming from, but is my understanding of this necessary? Like maybe it is. If I'm in the meeting, it probably is. But like, is it necessary? And if I don't understand it, then we should ask the questions because maybe there are assumptions there. So I still think this is valuable in that context. Certainly want to defer to other people to talk about it. I don't think I'm the holder of all information here.
I wonder too if there isn't a statement we could write similar to like at the beginning of retros where we can say, you know, we're agile in the sense of shifting and pivoting, and as new data emerges, and it, you know, I change my mind. You know, like if we learn something new, we input that back in, and then we reapproach or as well as the other idea I had with agenda specifically is laying it out so that, you know, maybe you're working through the ladder in the right direction. If it's a meeting specifically for that kind of a working through a decision, but you could have a placeholder too. You don't necessarily have to fill in the conclusion or the prescription. You could have it in mind that this is maybe where I'm thinking we're going, but you know, or you could pose it as a question, might be another way to make it less prescriptive and more like, is this a good direction? This is a thought I have or an idea I have, you know, and see if the meeting goes in the same direction. But I think, yeah, applying that to an agenda, I think is a really neat idea.
So I think the philosophical term you're looking for, Daniel, is strong opinions loosely held. So the concept of I'm going to make a statement, I'm going to stand on it, and then you're going to challenge me on it, and then I may quickly pivot my position based on that.
Yeah, one of my favorite phrases we say. I love that.
Yeah. So Seth, getting back to your point, like I wouldn't do this on every topic in a one-on-one or in every conversation, but it's certainly conceivable that if you were in a safe space where maybe it was a less difficult conversation. I don't know if I'd do it in a truly difficult conversation. I might start with the proposal and then start going down the ladder with the different pieces of this is the reason why I'm thinking this way, and then see in the conversation where that breaks down. The reason why we generally start with the proposal first is just because it's easier to work out and generally short circuits a lot of processes. I wouldn't necessarily say in a productive conversation that's your intent. Your intent more is to get across, you know, what you're trying to change or trying to justify. So to your point, like it's almost like you have different types of agenda items, ones that are mechanical around proposal process kind of things, and other ones around productive conversations. I'm not sure if that helps or not, but like that's at least how I think about it in the context of this. I mean, one thing we now are starting to do with particularly our MRs is you're supposed to put in the why of why you're doing an MR, right? So I think that's kind of starting to work that direction in that regard.
Perfect. That's gives me a bit to think about. Thank you.
Can we, sorry, Dennis, I don't mean to be a pain, but Daniel's question is still hovering down below there, and I didn't mean to have a gap there. Thanks.
That actually, it might actually answer mine. So I was going to preface mine with, could we answer Daniel's?
Well, I'm just going to move it up the agenda. Yeah, cool. Go ahead, Daniel. Now you probably want to unmute though.
Trying to signal my mute, but also have, yeah, okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, so in the document, I just linked to an Amazon book, and I was curious if that was the book referred to in the document, you know, talking about from difficult conversations, or if we could get the link to that book if we wanted to dive deeper into that.
I think that is the book, but I'll go double check and I'll share it back in this agenda. Sorry, Daniel, I wish I had an answer to that already.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Dennis, does that answer your question?
No. So I have to kind of brain dump this. I apologize. I'm trying to process it. So I'm reading about communicating feelings as part of exercising empathy. That totally makes sense. And then there's like kind of, you know, in all caps, do not react to answers. The thought I have, and perhaps this is because I haven't read difficult conversations, I've read crucial conversations, and I don't know how closely related they are. Essentially, you know, making sure you communicate the feelings to try to keep things safer so that people feel more at ease about communicating and collaborating, right? Does it make sense? I guess the question I have is like, does it make sense because we have a line about do not react to answers? Does it make sense to include something about perhaps identifying and knowing when perhaps you need to step away from it if you are reacting or the other person is reacting, to be able to kind of get to point 6 to be able to collaborate for resolution? This might be kind of stepping into a different tangent because perhaps at this point the productive conversation has become a critical or crucial one, or difficult, whichever term.
Well, I think, I mean, I feel pretty strongly about the empathy side of things, and I think that empathy can come in a couple of forms. You know, you can consider what it is that someone else is going through, what they're experiencing, and try to make some assumptions. There's that inference ladder again, about what it is they're dealing with. Or you could just have a conversation about it. Like, it depends on the context of the conversation. You might want to just sort of clearly state, I'm feeling X. One of the models that I think comes from radical transparency, which I've used in orgs before and has been kind of a little odd. It can be a little bit not inclusive sometimes with people that find it difficult. But one of those is to, you know, when you do X, it makes me feel like Y. And that's not a judgment or an accusation. It's just a statement of a cause and effect that people can understand. But sort of an approach you could make there, depending on, again, what the conversation is about, is sort of try to clearly state how you're feeling and identify that and share that with the person you're speaking with so that they can understand where you're coming from and maybe have a conversation starting there. Recognizing that you're, again, back to the ladder of inference, recognizing that your perception and the pool of data that you'll be generating from like having this conversation will be impacted by your own state of mind, and sharing that might be the way to go forward there. I don't know if that's helpful, if that's in line with what you were saying. And I think the comment around this overlapping with crucial conversations is totally on point. I believe they're either the same family, same author, or very closely related. So I'll find the book though. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it would be productive or helpful to, like, in the same, like, underneath do not react to answers, like kind of a reminder to not be afraid to clearly state your feelings if you do end up feeling strongly about something, because it might be easy to forget that, and then you might carry that emotion into 6, which could color things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And being starting with some sense of awareness is really valuable, I think. And that's part of where the ladder of inference can be helpful, right? Like, let's evaluate where I'm at right now. Did Nick or Christopher or anyone else, I mean, this isn't about us like talking at everyone. If other people have thoughts, please feel free to jump in.
I was actually going to jump in because my comment actually, the next thing kind of was trying to follow that. Like there are other things that I learned from like Thinking Fast and Slow, the book there, talking about going in like and prepping for a meeting and even reflecting afterwards, like realizing other, you know, Christopher called it out as biases earlier, but I think it's also like just places that you're coming from of, because we're all in different time zones too, it calls it out. But I've even noticed in other, both here and at other companies, is it before lunch or after lunch? Because if before lunch you may be hangry, after lunch you may be tired, that's really going to influence how you want to make a decision, or one of your teammates. Like even just the basic things like that are important. But then, you know, like with the whole COVID situation, it also comes from like, are people stressed out? Like, are they in that place? Because everybody's experience is different there. So I think I'd like to, you know, like we called it bias earlier, but I think it also comes into the empathy thing from what you were just talking about, and, you know, like trying to understand that other person's situation. And also, and sometimes it's understanding where I am coming into that meeting. Like if I'm in the, for me, if I'm in the before lunch phase, it's not a good time to be making a decision because I'm probably going to rush it because I'm like, I just want to get on to food. So, you know, there's things like that you got to realize, like it may be better to just gather the data for the decision, but, you know, and come to a conclusion, but then reflect on the action afterwards when you know you're in a different mental state. I don't even know where I'm wandering all that, but that was kind of coming together in my head of like making sure, you know, of some of the other biases was what it started as, is, you know, you can be anchoring to a number, you can be being driven by the recency bias, like Christopher called out, like making sure you know your frame of mind on some of those things is also a useful piece of data.
I like the candid link to food. I think a lot of us may resonate with like high intensity meetings, like you're just off of like an OKR review, key review, or an RCA with a customer involving those tend to influence that. I think I'm going to resonate a tone here from Christopher, and it's all about self-awareness. Like even if you work with an agenda already, but just the fact that if you realize that this may be prescriptive, or you realize that you need to climb down the ladder, that's already a win. And then as you get better, you build muscle memory around it. Like fast forward 6 months from now, you might just revert to this mindset automatically, and then you're just grown those memory muscles that you just use this as a natural instinct. I'm not in that state, by the way, so I still have a lot to improve as well.
Just quickly, Dennis, did you get your question answered? I know we kind of slid into Dave's question, so I just wanted to make sure that had answered your questions.
Yeah, I think so. I think part of it is just evaluating kind of as you go through each step, the ladder, and doing those mental checkpoints. That's kind of my takeaway from it. So I believe my question's been answered. Thanks for circling back.
Yeah, cool. You're welcome. Yeah, and I think, I don't know whether it's just because something I practiced on your question comments, Dave, was I'm just super curious about people. So I find myself, when I manage to flip that switch into powerful questions, I'm just like, oh, but why did you decide to do that? And I'm not like questioning anyone because I don't agree with them. I'm just really curious because I'm learning about, you know, how people come to conclusions, how they think, how that specific person thinks about a situation. And it's an opportunity to learn a different way of thinking, a different perspective, a different set of data, a different set of experiences, right? So like, to me, it just becomes like, that's my puzzle, you know, because I like the problem solving that maybe a lot of us started out writing code. That was what we did, right? So for me, that's kind of turned into my puzzle. The thing I really love about being a people manager is like, oh, okay, so why did you do that? Oh, that's really cool. I wouldn't have thought of that. Thanks. You know, you get to learn a heap when you start really asking people how they think and how they come to conclusions. So that's where I'd come back to with that is maybe to practice that. Like, why? Like coffee chats. You can do it when it's not a difficult conversation. Oh, why did you think that? Like practice in a low-key environment where you can really learn to put that to the test. Cool. Anyone else have thoughts or comments, questions that I'd like to ask? I know a bunch of us have been relatively quiet, and I want to encourage people to ask. Always feel free to reach out to any of us, Christopher, Mech, myself. Sometimes it's not super comfortable asking questions in these sorts of bigger group meetings, but please feel free to reach out if you have any other questions, or do so here, of course. Cool. Mac, do you want to just verbalize your last comment? It looks like you have that.
Sure. We discussed a little bit on the powerful questions as part of step 4. I just did a quick upload, and this was something that Daniel Croft actually shared, I think, last year. Some of us are using it. I think it was like a scan of a piece of paper, but now since we're in 7CTO, this is the official version of it. So feel free to use it as your powerful questions. I think it is the Lego piece for step 4.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I love this. It works so well. Just from your own perspective and thinking about asking yourself the same questions, like what do I mean by that? But having someone else help you with that sort of process of evaluating how you're thinking is super valuable. So thanks for sharing that, Mac. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for sharing it. The credit goes to you.
I guess thanks for remembering that I did a thing a while ago that I totally forgot.
I think
Cool.
if this group find ourselves in like a meeting, a challenge processing, I think we know which framework we're going to be using. We ask what else are what data are we missing and all that. So I think it's great. It's a good framework.
Cool. Yeah, okay, so we've got a little bit of time left, but if people don't have other questions, it'd be awesome. I'm happy to let to call it here. I want to give people a minute to ask the questions, but I've been told that awkward silences are no longer our thing. Go ahead.
Actually, I'm going to interrupt Daniel, and this is, I know, not my go-to, but I'm interrupting anyway. I'm going to actually challenge a little bit in regards to the fact of, rather than ask questions, Daniel put down at the bottom feedback that people find this helpful and what could potentially be better next time. So like really would love to get some feedback. Mac did one of these, I think back in February. This is the second one of these we've done. Just kind of curious to see if people find this useful or not. If they don't, that's totally fine. If you feel like you want to give the feedback anonymous, we'll try to figure out some different way of getting that kind of back. But I thought it was a good experiment from that perspective. But as like all experiments, if we don't see a good signal, then we may say, okay, well, we'll do something else or try something else from that perspective.
Yeah, and I wasn't, just to be clear, I wasn't about to end the meeting. I was going to be like, okay, with no one else other questions, please give us feedback. So 100%, Christopher.
Problem is you're eating on all that feedback time. That's the thing you got to remember.
I'll stop talking. I apologize.
People then will go on in the next meeting and then they won't get to it. Right? It's better to get the feedback in now in real time.
Yep. Cool. I'm going to ask everyone who's watching this video afterwards. The agenda is shared. If anyone needs to give feedback from watching the video, please do so. We'd love that feedback. And having said all of that, Seth?
Yeah, Daniel, is there a spot this is going to live in the handbook? Is it under people ops or do you know where it's going to be?
So we're definitely going to put it, Daniel I think is going to upload it, and we're definitely going to put it on the engineering manager training because I think it's super valuable there. If we think it should go also on engineering IC training, we can consider it there as well. But definitely on the engineering manager training. Whether it gets to people ops, I'll have to talk to Juliana about that in a separate discussion.
Thanks.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. I'm going to stop the recording now, and I hope everyone has a lovely rest of their day, whatever that looks like.